Hello, class. As you know, we'll be spending a lot of our time doing close reading in this class. In order to do close reading effectively, we have to talk about what we call the elements of literature. Now, the elements of literature are the pieces of the stories, the novels, the plays, the short stories that we're going to be looking at and analyzing in order to help us do our close reading and to help us determine what it is that the author is actually trying to accomplish in his story. The first element of literature we're going to talk about is the plot of the story. Now, if you want to follow along in your textbook, chapter 1 of your textbook is on plot. Now, a lot of what they say in the book is similar to what I'm going to say here. This PowerPoint, I've had this PowerPoint for a while before we had this book, so it's not necessarily going to match exactly, but the general ideas will be the same. Don't think about it in terms of right and wrong. I know some of you are thinking, I'm going to listen to the PowerPoint and not read the book because Mr. Nixon's going to be right. Don't think about it that way. It's not about right and wrong. We're just trying to inform you as to the pieces of the story we're going to be looking at so that we can analyze it more successfully. All right, so the first one is plot. So the question you might be asking is, what is the plot? The plot is what happens to certain characters at a certain time. But plot goes beyond what happens to certain characters. It's also how what happens is revealed. Okay, so in other words, there are important elements of plot that go beyond what is happening. The how of the plot is really, really important. It's not just what, it's also how. There are 5 elements of plot we're going to be talking about in this PowerPoint. They are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The exposition of the plot is essentially the basic situation. All right, so the basic situation includes 3 things. The first part of the basic situation is the setting. The setting is both where and when the story takes place. It's not just where, it's not just when, but it's both. So, for example, with the novel A Lesson Before Dying, the where of that setting is really important. The Louisiana part of the setting, it tells us a lot about the kinds of people we're dealing with, the kinds of white people and the kinds of black people. The when is also important. The story takes place in the 1940s. The story could not take place in the same way if it were set in the 1980s, let's say, or the 1840s. It'd be a completely different story. So the where and the when are both important parts of the setting. Another very important part of the setting having to do with when is the time of day. Now with a novel, the time of day is probably less relevant because you'll probably have things that happen at different times a day. In fact, that's not really true. So you'll have things that happen at different times a day in a novel, but certain things will happen at certain times a day and other things will happen at other times a day. So the time of day is still important there. But let me give you an example from a movie. If you've ever seen a Batman movie, and if you haven't seen a Batman movie, then shame on you. But if you've ever seen a Batman movie, you'll probably notice that most of the action in a Batman movie takes place at night. Compare that to a Superman movie. Most of the action in a Superman movie takes place in the daytime. And that's the reason. The reason for that is the kinds of characters Batman and Superman are, respectively. Batman, his other nickname is the Dark Knight. Batman is most effective at night. He uses the shadows, he uses the darkness to help hide himself from his enemy and basically surprise them, and that's one of his advantages. Superman needs no such advantages. He's made of steel, so he can just face anything at any time. Also, Superman is inherently good. Batman is not inherently good. This was illustrated in the second of the Batman trilogy called The Dark Knight. If you haven't seen that movie, that is your homework to watch The Dark Knight. But in that movie, there's a scene where I was joking about the homework thing. Sorry. Anyway, in that movie, there's a scene where Batman, or Bruce Wayne rather, wants to go check on Gotham Hospital, Gotham General, I think is the name of the hospital, because the Joker has threatened to blow up the hospital. And Alfred says to Bruce, "Are you going to take the Bat-Pod?" And Bruce says, "In the daytime?" As though the idea of taking the Batmobile out in the daytime is ridiculous. And if you think about it, it kind of is. It's a joke that the director, Christopher Nolan, is telling about the kind of character Batman is. You don't do Batman stuff in the daytime. So the time of day is a really, really important part of the when of the setting. The second part of the exposition after setting is the main characters. We're going to have a completely different PowerPoint on all the characters and the process of developing them. But for exposition, we're concerned with mainly the protagonist. The protagonist is the main character. I'm going to ask you a question. In A Lesson Before Dying, who is the protagonist? Think about it before you answer. Who is the protagonist of A Lesson Before Dying? The protagonist is the character who is trying to accomplish, like the story is about the person trying to accomplish a goal, pretty much. Who is the person trying to accomplish the goal? That's the protagonist of the story. Who's the protagonist of A Lesson Before Dying? Okay, we also concerned ourselves with, in the exposition, we're also concerned with the antagonist. The antagonist is the person or group or force that opposes the protagonist, which we'll talk about more here in just a second. The third part of the exposition is the conflict. Now, in order to determine the conflict, ask yourself first, what does the protagonist want? And then second, what is it that's preventing the protagonist from getting what he or she wants? Keep in mind, this is really, really important. In fact, over the years, I've had a hard time reinforcing this next thing I'm about to say to some of my students. So please remember what I'm about to say. This next bullet's really important. The protagonist versus the antagonist is not necessarily good versus evil. Okay? The protagonist is not automatically the good guy. The antagonist is not automatically the bad guy. The protagonist, by definition, is the main character. The antagonist is the force that opposes the main character. So if we write a story about Jesus saving the world, the protagonist is Jesus. The antagonist is everything that opposes Jesus. If we write a story about Satan deceiving the world, the protagonist is Satan. The antagonist is anything that opposes Satan. Does that make sense? So protagonist is not versus antagonist, not necessarily good versus evil. It's main character versus whatever his opposition is, or her, or its. Also keep in mind that the antagonist doesn't have to be a character at all. The antagonist can be a mindset, it can be a situation, it can be a force of nature. Sometimes the antagonist is included in the setting. Sometimes where the story takes place is an important part of the opposition that the protagonist faces. Alright, so the antagonist does not have to be a character. Keep in mind also that every interesting story has some sort of conflict. Now there are two categories of conflict I want to tell you about. The first category is external conflict. External conflict is conflict that is caused by a force outside of the character. So that can be a person versus another person. It can be a person versus a group of people. It could be a person versus nature. And like I said, it could be person versus setting. That would be the person versus nature. The other kind of conflict is internal conflict. Internal conflict is conflict that is caused by a force inside of the character. So with internal conflict, you have self-doubt as an option, you have shyness, you have lack of emotional control. This is not an exhaustive list, but internal conflict basically is some sort of conflict that a person has within him or herself. We'll talk a little later about some of the internal conflicts that some of us face that prevent us from getting the things that we want. The second element of plot after the exposition is called rising action. It's also called complications. Rising action, by definition, is the events leading to the climax. We'll talk about climax in just a second. But rising action, everything leading up to the climax is rising action. The rising action is a series of complications. With the rising action, we'll see new problems. We'll see complications on the initial problems that we had. Alright, so rising action, things get more complicated. An important part of storytelling that we must consider is timing. Timing is the order in which events are presented. Now, if you've ever watched a TV show or a movie or even read a book, you've probably seen some variation on chronological order. Now, stories do not have to be told in chronological order, as you know. We don't have to present orders. We don't have to present events in order from the earliest to the latest. We don't have to tell our story from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. We could do it in any order we want, really, with storytelling. As a matter of fact, there's a really interesting movie by Christopher Nolan, the same dude that did the Batman trilogy. It's called Memento. It's a story that's told in reverse order. So what he does is he takes like a 10-minute segment of action and he shows you that segment, and then after that, he shows you the 10 minutes that occurred right before the 10 minutes you just saw. So he'll play each 10-minute segment in order, right? It's all going forward, but when he cuts the scene, it goes back to what happened right before that, and the story is basically told backwards. Really, really interesting. Anyway, so chronological order is not the only option that storytellers have. Sometimes they'll use some different devices. One of them is called foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when they give you clues that hint at future events. So they might tell you something in chapter 2 that hints at something that happens in chapter 7, for example. They also use something called flashback. Flashback is when they interrupt action to tell what might have happened before. They also have flash forward. Flash forward is when they visit the future of a character or a situation or a town or setting or whatever. With flashback and flash forward, they typically almost always they'll return to the original timeline. So they might be telling you a story in 1975. They'll flash back to 1945, and then they'll return to 1975 to the original timeline. And what they're doing with that flashback moment, and flash forward is used in a very similar way, what they do with that moment is give you more information that enriches your understanding of the current timeline, the timeline in which the story is taking place. The third part of plot, after exposition and rising action, is the climax. Now, you probably know of the climax as the high point in the plot, as the most exciting or most suspenseful moment. That is a good definition of climax, but I have a better one. This definition of climax is better for our purposes than just the most exciting moment. The climax is the turning point in the plot. With the climax, something is going to happen to make the ending possible. Something's going to change. Something's going to be adjusted to make the conclusion possible. Now, again, the high point in the plot is a good definition. The story's most exciting or suspenseful moment, those are good definitions, but that first one is better, the turning point in the plot. It's also more comprehensive, it's more universal. So, with the turning point idea, something's going to happen that's going to decide the outcome of the conflict. Now, you might not know what the climax is while you're watching the movie or the show or while you're reading the book, but at the end of the story, it should be obvious. The turning point should be obvious at the end of the story because you'll know how the story ends, so you'll know what had to have happened in order to facilitate that ending. The next part is the falling action. The falling action of the story is, by definition, the aftermath of the climax. So the climax is going to happen, and then other things are going to happen after that as a result of the climax. That's falling action. Falling action is the results of the high point or the results of the turning point. Problems are sometimes resolved with the falling action, although they don't have to be. Loose ends are sometimes tied up, although they don't have to be. There's a word in French for falling action. The word is denouement. It's French for untying. Now, your textbook will say that they don't use this word when they talk about falling action, and we'll use it here and there, but not really. The reason the textbook doesn't want to use it is because denouement is used to represent a few different things, and it could be confusing to some people. So, for now, we'll leave it out. So we won't include denouement as one of the words to describe our elements of plot. The last element of plot is resolution. Resolution is the final event of the story. All right, so sometimes, like I was just saying, sometimes the resolution and the denouement are considered the same plot element. So again, don't worry so much about the French word. That's just a little extra for you. It's a little AP word for you. All right, so the 5 elements of plot: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Okay, so you're going to want to take out a half sheet of paper. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and this is going to be your ticket out the door. Here we go. Number 1, what is a protagonist? Number 2, what is the difference between external conflict and internal conflict? Number 3, identify and describe one type of timing used in storytelling. I gave you 4, so identify and describe just one of those 4. Keep in mind, when answering number 2, that if you're asked about the difference between 2 things, you have to answer both things. If I ask you the difference between external conflict and internal conflict, and you describe external conflict, that doesn't tell me how it's different from internal conflict, which is the question. So make sure you address both items, external conflict and internal conflict, in order to answer number 2 appropriately. Okay, so attached to Monday's lesson plan is a plot diagram. What I would like you to do is to download the plot diagram, keep one on your computer. I'll print some out and I'll have some in the classroom for you. But what we're going to do next is we're going to use a story that we all know, Little Red Riding Hood, to complete a plot diagram. Now, a plot diagram is it's a device. I can't remember what the thing is called, but it's a device that we use to basically chart the 5 elements of the plot, the 5 elements we just talked about. All right, so if you look at the plot diagram, you'll see what I'm talking about. All 5 elements are on there: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. It's also got some other items on there in terms of theme and some other things. Don't worry about those right now. We'll get to those later. You can leave that box blank. Okay, so on your plot diagram, if you can't write on the plot diagram, you can just type it or write it on a piece of paper. But on your plot diagram, under exposition, you want to write this information. The protagonist of the story is Red. The antagonist is the wolf. The setting in terms of time is afternoon. The setting in terms of place is the woods and Grandma's house. The internal conflict for Red is her naivete. The external conflict for Red is that the wolf wants to eat her. And that is the exposition of Little Red Riding Hood. Remember, we said that rising action is the events that lead up to the climax. In this case, the rising action is Red turns down Wolf's offer to ride his motorcycle, and then Wolf races to Grandma's house. Wolf scares Grandma and takes her place in bed. And then Red arrives at Grandma's house to give her some cookies, and Wolf tries to eat Red. So in this case, the climax of the story is both the turning point and the most exciting moment. That will happen sometimes. So in this case, the climax is this: Grandma rides Wolf's motorcycle, catches him in the handlebars, and hurls him into a thorn bush. The aftermath of the climax, which is the falling action, is that Wolf goes to prison, and then Grandma goes on a talk show tour, making stops at Oprah, Dr. Phil, and Maury Povich. Finally is the resolution, the final event of the story. Grandma and Red live happily ever after. Alright, so you should have a completed plot diagram, or at least the 5 elements of this story written on a piece of paper. You should have 3 questions answered on a half sheet of paper in TOD form. You should have notes related to the plot in a notebook of some kind. I don't have a Nixonism for you today, sorry. But make sure you have those things with you on Wednesday. Stay safe on tomorrow. Honestly, I don't anticipate the weather is going to get too bad around here. If you've lived in Huntsville any time, you probably noticed that people get a little scary and they shut stuff down before it happens, and then a lot of times nothing even happens for us. So enjoy your day. If we do have weather concerns, then stay safe. And of course, we're still praying for people in Houston and people in Florida. Have a great night, and we'll see you around on Tuesday, but we'll see you in class on Wednesday.